In the previous video, you saw that posthumous public exposure is no more legal today than cannibalism is in the modern world, for precisely the same medical reasons. You couldn't get two bodies to rot on the streets of Jerusalem for 3 days if you wanted, and tried to stage the event on purpose. You would be arrested. The practice of posthumous public exposure is historically dated, just like the demographics of Jerusalem, given in the text, which are 1. Verse 9, predominantly Gentile, and 2. Verse 13, 70,000 or less, in population. Those are factual observations that require no interpretation, just honesty. Thirdly, if that were not enough, you have a timeline in verse 2 that puts the beginning of these events, a long time ago in history. No matter how you interpret it. The 2 is simply a factual observation. The only two dating options given in John's statement in verse 2 are 134 AD or 1390 AD, both in the past. And in verse 4, John states emphatically that his reference to the two witnesses in the following text is symbolical in nature, stating that they are two olive trees and two candlesticks, standing before God, already, in the present tense, in 95 AD, when he is writing. The historic contexts of those demographic and cultural conditions are beyond mistake, and they rule out the Counter-Reformation's claim that God has appointed two religious terrorists, at the end of the world, who will walk through the streets of Jerusalem, burning Muslims and Jews alive on the spot, with their fire-breathing superpowers, uninhibited by law enforcement. You also saw that the two witnesses were called, my two witnesses, by the rainbow angel in chapter 10, because they witnessed a sworn oath to heaven, that Chronos should be no more. And like the rainbow angel, known as Kisiel in Hebrew, the two witnesses were John's reference to Mars in retrograde, in the constellation Gemini, which provided astronomical dating for his coming prophecy, in chapter 11. Those who still cling to the claims of Counter-Reformation eschatology are failing to comprehend the modern world that surrounds them, or possibly they're in denial about it, all for the sake of a dated interpretation by Counter-Reformationists intentionally designed to deceive, from centuries ago, that never had to imagine such a modern world and how it nullifies their futurist claims about the end of the world. Those interpretations were shown to be simply, factually, wrong. And when it comes to the statistically based demographics and population numbers referenced in the text and also known in history, Counter-Reformation theology is simply arguing against the plain math and language of the actual text itself. Before we begin going through chapter 11 verse by verse, and constructing John's time frame, there is one matter of historical background, which is relevant to these texts, in chapter 11. In the ancient world, in biblical Jewish culture, when Jews discuss constellations, they were uncomfortable with all the names of the constellations bearing the names of Greek gods, which they were not even supposed to mention by name, in the Torah. Just as many Christians are still even to this day. So, as you see John doing in Revelation, out of religious necessity, they came up with their own words, associations, and definitions, for these astronomical constellations. When it came to the constellation Gemini, they were confronted with Greek culture's interpretation of Gemini, as two heroic figures, Castor and Pollux, who were placed in the sky, by Zeus. The Hebrew mind naturally associated with this dual constellation, two biblical heroes who were said to have been transported to heaven, that being, Elijah and Enoch. It was a natural fit for this constellation, and provided an easy Hebrew-based association, as an alternative to the Greek gods, Castor and Pollux. When Rome exterminated the Jews who produced the New Testament documents, and replaced them with their own Roman assimilationists who were known as Nicolaitans, in the New Testament, the interpretation of those documents, also, had to be replaced with a version of interpretation that was flattering to Rome, and its political goals. The interpretation of the book of Revelation was condemned, and replaced as well. And this is not a conspiracy theory. It is fully documented history. As shown previously, the alleged bishops who attended the Nicene Council were not Christian bishops at all. Because the apostolic tradition, recorded in the New Testament, defined a bishop as a married man, with a family, who could serve as a leader in a local community. None of the Roman bishops, who attended any of Rome's councils, fulfilled those biblical qualifications, and thus, none were real bishops. Instead, they were the very impostors described by Paul in 1 Timothy 4, verses 1 through 3. One of these bishops was someone from Egypt named Athanasius, who is famous for citing the index of New Testament books we have today in our modern New Testament. He cited them because they were already in widespread use as a collection, and he appealed to them as authoritative to falsely claim he was apostolic. But in the same letter where he cites the New Testament, in fact, the first paragraph even before he gets to the famous text about the New Testament, he begins his letter with a denunciation of something that rarely gets any attention. This is what he says, quote, "They have fabricated books which they call books of tables, in which they show stars, to which they give the names of saints. And therein of a truth they have inflicted on themselves a double reproach, those who have written such books, because they have perfected themselves in a lying and contemptible science. And as to the ignorant and simple, they have led them astray by evil thoughts concerning the right faith established in all truth and upright in the presence of God." End quote. Athanasius's faith, as he calls it, was neither the right faith, nor was it established in all truth. It was established by genocide and deceit. God had nothing to do with it. But beyond this Egyptian, being a fake bishop, an anti-Semite, and a bold-faced liar, his comments about books which connect stars to saints was the first thing he wanted to state in his letter, because to him it was the most important. The saints Athanasius is referring to in his letter are not Catholic saints, most of whom were still to come in history future to Athanasius's time. The saints he is referring to are biblical saints from past ages, recorded in the scriptures. And the practices of associating biblical saints with the stars was not an adaptation of Greek astrology, but a replacement of its pagan cosmology, completely, with a biblical paradigm reaching into the definition of the heavens. And that was being done by the real New Testament community, responsible for the production of the New Testament documents, who not only disqualified the Egyptian Athanasius to even be a bishop at all, in any sense, but defined Athanasius as the very apostates prophesied by Paul. In that same New Testament, Athanasius was hypocritically citing in his own defense, despite the fact that the Egyptian fake bishop Athanasius attempted to discredit that information. Rome has been aware of it ever since. And while they keep themselves very busy hiding that information from the public, they have built observatories throughout history, even into our own modern day, to meticulously study and interpret those same stars Athanasius denounced. The same constellation scheme, found directly in the text of the New Testament itself, that Athanasius was either too stupid to understand, or too wicked to admit. While Athanasius's argument sounds very Christian on the surface, you have to remember what he was arguing for. Athanasius was arguing for the status quo. He was defending the practice of naming not only the constellations after the Greco-Roman gods of paganism, he was defending the use of their names for the planets as well, and the use of the names of these pagan gods for Rome's calendar weeks, days and months. So in the end, Athanasius's arguments were nothing more than simply the attempt to justify the use and integration of Roman paganism by Constantine's empire against a truly biblical cosmology, which both the New Testament and Jewish communities had already attempted to reject and replace with biblical naming conventions or associations, just as you see used in the book of Revelation. And this is why the Counter-Reformation now must hide the real interpretation of Revelation from the public, while at the same time, it hypocritically tries to use the very same information as a source of secret knowledge, it officially and publicly condemned in favor of Greco-Roman paganism, to describe and interpret the heavens that God created for his own purposes, replacing his very signs in the heavens with the names of Greco-Roman demons from the Roman Empire. That is what Athanasius was in reality defending behind his pious-sounding insults against the Jewish New Testament community. The same community which had in reality actually produced the book of Revelation itself. And they continued to develop and expand the practice for the purposes of prophecy that John set forth in his work in 95 AD. the fake Egyptian bishop Athanasius, reveals in his own comments, he was not part of this original community, and had no understanding of either their intents and purposes, nor of their literature. Today, you will hear some counter-Reformation rapture theology preachers, saying that Enoch and Elijah are the two prophets. What they will not tell you, is where that idea came from historically. Historically, it was Enoch and Elijah, of the constellation Gemini, because that is what Gemini referred to in the Christian interpretation of the constellations. The same biblical association which Athanasius denounced, and Rome kept hidden, even while it tried to use that very same information, as a secret source of knowledge. The two witnesses were Enoch and Elijah, in the historical sense. Because Gemini was interpreted to be Enoch and Elijah, by Jews, who were replacing the Greek constellation scheme, which these same counter-Reformationist ministers never bothered to mention as the actual origin of that association to begin with. They simply spit out that association, conveniently never mentioning how it originated as the constellation Gemini, cited in the book of Revelation, that Athanasius himself cited, without ever having a clue about its actual contents. It was doing the very same thing he condemned in his letter, citing the book. John, however, simply calls them the two witnesses, and states in verse 4, he is intentionally speaking symbolically. What Athanasius's letter does show, however, is that the redefinition of the Greek constellation system into a symbolism system of biblically defined saints was in existence in Athanasius's own day in 367 AD. And the community that produced that information did not recognize Athanasius as a valid Christian bishop. And while Athanasius denounced their attempts to redefine the Greek constellation system with biblical saints, preferring the pagan Greco-Roman polytheistic system instead, he apparently did not know the very process he was denouncing was in the very same New Testament he falsely cited to assert himself as apostolic. You will run into traditionalists who will simply refuse to believe the text in Revelation is making reference to astronomical dating. And they will do so with insults, outcries and accusations. They will offer ad hominem attacks against you as a person, rather than deal with the contents of these texts. And yet, as they make their accusations, they will be defending the most pagan interpretation of Revelation in its history. An interpretation of recent origin, and of Roman extraction. They will interpret every reference to the word angel as the literal manifestation of a giant Greek demonic spirit, which used to be known as a Nike, as the fulfillment of those texts. But when they substitute Greek Nikes for John's reference to the planets and constellations he is using to date his material, they are doing it in spite of what is actually found in the text and the literal grammar and language of the text, while at the same time pretending to defend its literal interpretation. But, which of course, nothing about their interpretation is actually literal. The facts of the text in Revelation 11 simply rule out the Counter-Reformation's explanation of this text as two prophets who walk the streets of Jerusalem at the end of time, randomly burning alive residents of Jerusalem with fire that literally comes out of their mouth. That is just not what the text is saying. And here is how you can positively know that is the case. First, the time frame. John states that they exist in the day of his writing in 95 AD when he uses the present tense in verse 4. And they are standing in the presence of God. He then states that 42 months after Jerusalem is given to the Gentiles, the two witnesses are empowered to prophesy in verse 3. And we have gone over the point numerous times, that reference point produces only two dates. Both long ago in the past, because John gives only a continuous timeline from when Jerusalem is given to the Gentiles, to the time they are empowered to prophesy. There is no gap in his timeline from that date. And that date is a known date in history, of 130 AD. When Jerusalem was renamed the Olea Capitolina, and literally given to the Gentiles just as John prophesied. If you claim those 42 months are 3.5 years, then that leaves you with the date of the two witnesses at 134 AD. And the whole scenario is expired after 138 AD. Which is definitely not future. And if you take these references as Hebraic prophetic dating, that leaves you with the year 1390 AD when John starts his timeline in chapter 11, and that is over 1,000 years later after 130 AD. Meaning if they were two literal people, they would have to be over 1,000 years old by 1390 AD. And those are your only two options. They came in 134 AD or they came in 1390 AD and were over 1,000 years old when they came. There is no way to explain the time frames of this text other than by way of John's references to astronomical dating. Secondly, in verse 19, John clearly and openly states, the temple he is talking about in verse 1 and 2, is in heaven, not on the earth. And the two witnesses are standing in the presence of God in heaven. Heaven and sky are the same word in Greek. The temple is in heaven, and the two witnesses are in heaven, as he is describing this narrative. So how can the two witnesses be standing in the presence of God, in heaven, and at the same time be on earth doing all these things? Obviously those facts rule out literalism, because that cannot be literally done. If you look into heaven to find two candlesticks and two trees and two witnesses, you are going to obviously recognize a clear reference to Gemini, because they are known as the two. Even the symbol for Gemini is the number 2. And thirdly, people who reject John's astronomical dating never explain chapter 1 verse 20, where John openly states that is what he is writing. And he says, the 7 stars are the angels to the 7 ecclesia, translated churches. So it stands to reason then, that if you simply outright, irrationally and unconditionally reject those 7 stars as the messengers to the 7 ecclesia, as John actually wrote, it's probably because you are not part of the ecclesia, despite your claims. Because John writes they are messengers to the ecclesia. And naturally someone who is a real ecclesia, meaning a called out one, would, by nature, have something within them that would instinctively reject the explanation of Greek Nikes, and recognize the truth of what John had written. Because John was appealing to that divine instinct in his statement, in chapter 1 verse 20. And someone who is not really a part of the real ecclesia would naturally never be persuaded otherwise, because their messengers are the Greek Nikes from Athena, who is the Greek descendant version of the Babylonian mother goddess, Ishtar. Someone who innately cannot give up their Greek Nike spirits as their authentic spiritual messengers, is obviously someone who has a very strong spiritual attachment to Ishtar, and could not fathom giving up their Nike spirits. Even if all this is occurring on an unconscious or subconscious level within them. Because they are subconsciously forced to remain consistent with the real nature and spirit of the thing that they in reality worship. And logical rational arguments and examinations of language and grammar will never convince them to give up those spirits. Despite the truth found in the texts themselves that may contradict them. But you can take comfort in the fact that while they attempt to employ insults, gaslighting techniques, and ad hominem attacks against you to run you away from the truths you have discovered, they are also revealing to you in that behavior who their real object of worship really is. The messenger spirits or angels of Ishtar are called Nikes. They have bird wings. The messengers, or angels of the real God, do not. They are real things. Real people, real animals, real plants, real stars, any real thing in the universe God created, that God chooses to speak through, is his angel or messenger, including you, when you deliver a message that God has spoken. That is one very simple way how you can know the difference between the real God of the scriptures and a false one that exists only within people's vain imaginations. If you demand that Greek Nikes be the angels John was writing about, despite the fact he says otherwise, then it would only be because you have a subconscious attachment to Greek Nikes that you cannot give up, no matter what is written in the biblical text. And that is what you will find to be the case for many people who call themselves Christians today, but in reality are part of something that John is going to call Mystery Babylon, or spiritual Babelism, in chapter 17 and 18 of this very same book. When it comes to prophetic time frames in the book of Revelation, as noted in earlier videos, John uses redundancy to locate his prophecies on the historical timeline. Redundancy means he uses a plurality of different dating methods to point to the same location on the historical timeline. The first and simplest method found in the text is historically dated content. As explained before, these are references that are dated historically by noting the use of military equipment, social customs or conventions, and/or situations or events, which are dated historically. But in addition to historically dated references in the text, John also uses astronomical dating, which was the basis of all calendar calculations in the ancient world. He notes constellation positions, astronomical events, meteor showers, comets, and eclipses to date his prophecies. And in addition to astronomical dating, he uses geological dating, also making numerous references to geological events in the Earth, such as volcanoes, earthquakes, cataclysmic storms and tsunamis. And, rather than all these things happening at the end of the world, they happen throughout history, on the historical timeline where John is placing his prophecies. John triangulates his prophecies on the historical timeline through these different tracks of information, so that their location can be easily found, if simply looked for. Counter-Reformation theology, on the other hand, ignores all these different tracks of information, and simply place everything in the entire book at the end of the world, in an arbitrary 7-year period, after a fictitious rapture that is never mentioned anywhere in John's book at all. And by the time we get to Revelation chapter 11, according to counter-reformationists, 1/3 of the planet has been blown off by an asteroid, and the remaining 2/3 of the planet has experienced a global nuclear holocaust. But miraculously, all the TV sets are still working fine, and there is no interruption of either basic electrical service or commercial news coverage at all. Despite the fact, in reality, such conditions would have rendered the entire planet uninhabitable for any human life, much less fully functioning TV sets. Two of these three literary methods, historical and geological, would be just two standard methods that could be used for any literature. In addition to these two, astronomical dating is also being used, as that is what John said he was doing in the text of his book, in Revelation chapter 1 verse 20. So that provides another layer of information to his readers to find the time frames he is prophesying about in his book. And also, as you have seen already throughout Revelation, there are passages which are mathematical problem texts, revealing blocks of time. They contain both numeric references and word problems. These texts, we have referred to as time conversion texts, because when they are accurately calculated, they provide another layer of time frame information. And when done accurately, they confirm and produce the very same results as the three previous methods mentioned. And chapter 11 contains 7 time conversion texts presenting numeric and word problems to further verify his time frame. But here in chapter 11 John goes even one step further. In addition to the 4 methods cited previously, he adds an extra time frame measurement in the text himself, beginning in the first verse of the text, through the use of a reference to numeric symbolism. He refers to it as a measuring reed. And he is instructed to measure the temple. Usually this text is read as conceptual religious symbolism only, but as you will soon see, the symbolism used in verse 1 and 2 are for the purpose of establishing his time frame for the first prophecy in verses 1 through 13. So, in chapter 11, John has provided 5 different ways to come up with the same value of time. And if they are interpreted correctly, they should all line up alongside each other and reveal a perfectly defined time frame for his prophecy. Unfortunately, Counter-Reformation theology has taught the public to simply ignore all John's information about his time frame, so that their claim it all occurs at the end of the world will not be exposed. But, like a puzzle, if this were all just random, or made up, by someone's imagination, there would be no way 5 entirely different dating methods, using every part of the universe we live in, would all result in the same exact time frame, fitting together perfectly like a puzzle, down to the last detail of information. But as you will soon see, they actually do. And they will provide amazing and incredible detail concerning John's real prophecy. The same real prophecy that Counter-Reformation has spent literally billions of dollars hiding, and centuries of time intentionally burying under constant public disinformation. As As we go through the first 13 verses in this chapter, we will track what each verse tells us in each category of timeline dating, verse by verse, and then look at the timeline it creates and the astronomical and geological events that should fall on the timeline in history John has laid out for us. On your screen, you see the chart we are going to use to go through this text and break down the time frame information into 5 different time frame categories. Historical and geological are straightforward and simple to understand because they are dating methods found in any form of literature. The astronomical dating category is additionally added because John said he was writing his book with that information included in chapter 1 verse 20. The mathematical category is the category of information that comes from the math of the text that John uses both as stated numeric values and as word problems, which you have seen previously, that we have called time conversion texts. The 5th category of information found uniquely in this text, which we label symbolical on our chart, is used by John for dating this specific chapter. So there are a total of 5 different dating systems, which the following text will be broken down into, providing information for its time frame. In the mathematical category, you will find John using repeating symbolic values over and over again to create time frame values in his texts, such as the number 7 and multiples of 7 from the Sabbath as the 7th day of the week, or the number 12 and multiples of 12 as in the 12 apostles, or the 12 tribes of Israel, or as a reference to Jerusalem, or for example, 144 being 12 times 12. You will also see the number 28, which was the number associated both with the woman's reproduction cycle, related to bearing life, and the sidereal cycle of the moon, representing the average cycle between 29.5 and 27.1 days in length, which the Hebrew calendar was actually based upon. And which why the ancient Hebrews associated the number 28 and the lunar cycle with the creation of life from God. These were all culturally familiar numeric values in ancient Jewish culture, and you will see John use them repeatedly in the following texts and his time frames. Revelation has 22 chapters. Chapter 11 is halfway through the book. The context of chapter 11 is set in the last verses of chapter 10, where John has described the rainbow angel having his hand lifted to heaven and swearing that Chronos should be no more. He then describes being given the Biblaridion by the same angel and being told to eat it, which he does, and he describes it as sweet in his mouth, but making his stomach bitter. Then he states he was told by the same angel that he must prophesy again about many peoples, nations, tongues and kings. And with that context we come to chapter 11, and verse 1, where John writes, quote, "And there was given me a reed like unto a rod, and the angel stood, saying, Rise, and measure the temple of God, and the altar, and them that worship therein." End quote. So what is verse 1 about? It's about a prophecy having to do with many peoples, nations, tongues and kings. That is the context John has established for the next 13 verses in chapter 11. The same verses that describe a measuring rod and introduces the 2 witnesses as the 2 olive trees of the never-ending menorah and the 2 Sabbath candlesticks. But chapter 11 is a prophecy about many peoples, nations, tongues and kings, even though the only location that is mentioned is Jerusalem. The same angel of chapter 10 is now telling John to arise and measure the temple. The word translated rise in the KJV is actually the word for awaken, meaning to wake up out of sleep. The only problem, of course, is that John was not sleeping. So the choice of that word there implies a spiritual awakening, and a standard being given to measure not only the temple and the sacrifice, but the worshippers therein. As you saw in the previous chapter, that standard was the emergence of our modern scriptures in the Wycliffe movement and the Lollards. But John is doing something else with this text because it precedes a prophecy. And after he records being told to take these measurements, he never records what the measurements were, nor what the readers were to do with them. But it is clear, he is prefacing his next section of text with these mathematical values taken from the temple. There were literally scores of different measurements associated with the temple. to make things more confusing, there were 3 different temples John could have been referencing. The first is Solomon's temple. The second is Herod's temple, or what is known as the Second Temple. And the third is Ezekiel's temple. Ezekiel's temple description was never actually physically built. Premillennialists therefore claim this temple will be physically built in Israel, anticipating the millennial reign of Christ on the earth. The problem with that claim, however, is that when John describes the New Jerusalem, he says verbatim in chapter 21 verse 22, that in the New Jerusalem, there is no temple, because God is the temple, and Christ is the sacrifice. John never writes of a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem. And that temple he is now describing as the subject of his measurement, is a temple which does not exist in physical Jerusalem, because the temple had already been destroyed by the Romans. And John clarifies what temple he is discussing in verse 19. He says it is the temple of God in heaven. Which leaves us with Ezekiel's temple. The only temple never built, and which was later interpreted by Jews to refer to the symbolic patterns of a divine temple in heaven. If the temple could have produced scores of complicated measurements, but had a few well-known references that would have been easily familiar to his readers, it would be more likely that John was making reference to something that would have been familiar to his audience and easily recalled from memory. If you take the commonly known measurements of Ezekiel's temple, of the sanctuary, the altar and those that worship therein, we would end up with the following simplified measurements. The temple itself had 3 sections to it. The inner court was 100 cubits, the sanctuary was 100 cubits, and the priestly quarters were 100 cubits. So that totals 300 cubits. The altar of sacrifice was 12 by 12. But he also mentioned those that worship therein. If you multiply 12 times 12 you get 144. And if you remember in chapter 8, 144 was the number of faithful martyrs, murdered by Rome, times 1,000. So that is why John coupled those 2 measurements together as the altar of sacrifice and those that worship therein. It was the same number, 144. If you add 144 from the altar and those that worship therein, to the 300 cubits from the temple, leaving out the outer court as John instructed, that gives you a very symbolic number of 444. But what do we do with that number? It's very poetic that it all adds up to 444, which is 3 fours, which also totals the very symbolic number of 12. A number which is also used as symbolic of the heavenly Jerusalem, in chapter 21. John describes the heavenly Jerusalem as having 12 foundations, 12 stones, 12 gates, displaying the names of 12 apostles and being 12,000 furlongs in length. And it is no accident that there are also 12 constellations along the celestial ecliptic. John's instruction to measure the temple and the altar and them that worship therein results in a highly symbolic number made up of 3 fours. Or 444, to be exact. 444 is the result of John's measuring reed. What appears to be an utterly amazing coincidence, before we even get into building a full timeline for this text, is that as we mentioned in the previous video, there is an earthquake that takes place on the historical timeline that matches the historical context of John's description for Jerusalem. It occurred in the year 1834. We know the beginning of John's timeline begins in 1390 AD. But here is what is absolutely amazing about John's measuring reed of 444. If you take the year 1834 and minus from it the year 1390, it will give you exactly 444 years. Which is oddly enough, the same exact value as John's measuring reed he gives at the beginning of his chapter. John has drawn a straight line from 1390 AD to 1834 AD before we even begin going through the rest of the chapter, which he calls a measurement of the temple, adding an entirely additional 5th way to measure his timeline in chapter 11. Now we will go through the rest of the 10 verses in chapter 11, from verse 3 to verse 13, and reconstruct John's historical timeline for his first prophecy, keeping in mind the measuring reed, which he has already given us, in verses 1 and 2, which results in 444 years, or 3 fours, the sum of which is 12. A number which is repeatedly used as a symbolical value for the city of Jerusalem itself. In verse 3, John states, quote, "And I will give power unto my 2 witnesses, and they shall prophesy 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth." End quote. The English word, power, is italicized, because it is not in the Greek text. The text literally reads, quote, "And I will give to my 2 witnesses." End quote. What will he give? He just says, after he gives, they prophesy. So what he gives, is something to do with empowering them to prophesy. In Judaism, that was the Ruach HaKodesh, the righteous, or hallowed spirit, or what Christians later came to call the Holy Spirit, as known as the infilling, or the anointing. There is astronomical dating information in this text. If you look up what planet was associated with this among Jews, you will discover it was the planet Jupiter. This planet was not called Jupiter among the Jews, it was called Sadek, from the Hebrew word for righteousness. It is literally described in Jewish sources as symbolizing the divine presence. The reference to being covered in sackcloth is used to describe obstruction of light, because sackcloth was made from black goat wool. The term is often used in Revelation to describe obstruction of light in the sky, or eclipses. As astronomical events, John is describing the planet Sadek, or Jupiter, entering Gemini, the 2 witnesses, along with 2 lunar eclipses. So we will put that in our astronomical column. Secondly, we see John has some time conversion math, or mathematical data, in this text. In the previous text John said 42 months. In this text he says 1260 days. Those are 2 values, which are identical. The only difference is that John has downshifted the time cycle. So you have to make an interpretive decision here between only 2 options. That downshift is either unimportant and should be ignored, or that downshift is very important, because that's the only difference in the 2 statements. If you have been watching this video series, you should know, by now, every detail of what John writes is important. If we take 1260 and downshift its value mathematically by moving the decimal 1 value over 1 place, instead of 1260 years, we'd get 126 years. So let's put that on our chart under the mathematical column. The year 1390 AD plus 126 years would give us the time conversion date of 1516 AD. So in the year 1516 AD we should expect to see, astronomically, Jupiter entering into Gemini, with 2 lunar eclipses, to confirm this time frame date of 1516 AD. In verse 4, John writes, quote, "These are the 2 olive trees, and the 2 candlesticks, standing before the God of the land." End quote. We discussed the symbolism John was making reference to in this statement in the previous video. But what we didn't cover was the other 2 pieces of information John gives in this text in reference to dating. The 2 candlesticks and 2 trees are 2 symbols that also describe a double meteor shower, in terms of astronomical dating. So we will put that information on our astronomical column. And if we look at the text mathematically, we see 2 symbols mentioned twice, which is 2 plus 2 or 2 times 2, which equals 4. The year 1516 AD plus 4 equals the year 1520. So in the year 1520, we should expect to see a double meteor shower, confirming John's astronomically dated timeline in chapter 11. In verse 5, John writes, quote, "And if any man will hurt them, fire proceedeth out of their mouth and devours their enemies, and if any man will hurt them, he must in this manner be killed." End quote. John writes that people will be killed, in the same manner that they wish to kill these witnesses. But then he specifies, by fire. So if they are going to be killed by being burned alive, that is precisely the way they wanted to harm these witnesses, by burning them alive. There are 2 witnesses, so John is prophesying 2 fires. Prophetically then, this is about the Roman Empire, burning God's witnesses, and a warning about a divine retribution, that 2 fires will come, in like manner, as a result of that action. We have a prophecy about burnings and fires. So we will put the word burnings, on the historical column, on our chart. This is an important prophetic event John is addressing in this section of text. So John provides 2 methods of dating the events of this text. One is astronomically, and the other is mathematically, using time conversion in the text. In terms of John's astronomical dating, you saw in the previous video that astronomically, this text was a reference to Mars in a retrograde motion crossing over the mouth star of Eugamorium, and that this was an extremely rare astronomical phenomena that occurred at a unique time in history. Mathematically, the phrase "in the same manner" represents the previous value squared, or multiplied by itself. Our previous value was 4. So 4 times 4 gives us 16. If we add 16 to the year 1520 AD, we'd get the year 1536. So historically, we should see the burning of witnesses, clothed in sackcloth, in 1536, marked by a sign in the heavens in Gemini, of fire coming out of the mouths of 2 witnesses, as a warning in the heavens, to the Roman Empire, of a divine retribution, of 2 fires. And this all is dated, on John's historical timeline, for the year 1536. In verse 6, John writes, quote, "These have power to shut heaven, that it rain not in the days of their prophecy, and have power over waters to turn them to blood, and to smite the earth with all plagues, as often as they will." End quote. We do not have any astronomical dating information in this text, or time conversion material. But we do have 3 very specific geological events, grossly listed: drought, waters turn to blood, and plagues. Waters turn to blood is biblical descriptive language for something known today as toxic algae bloom, or also known as red tide, because as you can see on your screen, it looks exactly like there is blood in the water. Thus the descriptive language you read in the Bible. So we will add these 3 things to our geological column: red tide, drought, and plague. We don't have a precise date yet for these 3 events, but we will be able to backfill a date for this text as we go down to a few more verses. In verse 7, John writes, quote, "And when they shall have finished their testimony, the beast that ascendeth out of the abyss shall make war against them, and shall overcome them, and kill them." End quote. We have astronomical, geological and historical time frame information in verse 7. First, John mentions the beast rising out of the abyss. There is a constellation called the sea beast, and it is pictured as rising out of the sea, or abyss. That constellation is known as Cetus. So we will put the word Cetus on our astronomical column. Next, John says that the beast will wage war against the 2 witnesses. So John is prophesying a war. We will put the word war in our historical column. And John also writes that the beast will win and the result will be the end of the 2 witnesses. So it is after this time prophetically that we should start looking for God's retribution against the beast in the 2 fires, which the sign in the heavens, in verse 5, promised was coming. So we will add the word fire to our geological column. In verse 8, John writes the following, quote, "And their dead bodies shall lie in the street of the great city, which spiritually is called Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified." End quote. He makes his reference to the practice of posthumous humiliation by corpse exposure, and gives us a time conversion in this text. This is a second reference to Jerusalem. This time, instead of calling it the Holy City, he calls it Sodom and Egypt. And he inserts into the text a reference to the martyrdom of Christ. The number for martyrs in chapter 8 was 144 times 1,000, and you saw John repeat the value of 144 from the altar of sacrifice in verse 1. Now he is repeating it again. In the Greek text, the word translated into English as the word street is actually the word for city square. City is the number 12, squared would be 144 again. If we add 144 to 1536 AD, that gives us the date for this text as 1680 AD. Now we can go back and average the distance between 1536 AD and 1680 AD. When we do that for the previous 2 texts, we get 1584 for the first date, and 1632 for the second date. So now we have a complete timeline from 1390 AD through 1680 AD with 4 astronomical events, 3 geological events, 3 historical events, and 5 mathematical or time conversion dates, for a total of 15 time frame references, in 8 verses. Next, in verse 9, John writes, quote, "And they of the people and kindreds and tongues and nations shall see their dead bodies 3 days and a half, and shall not suffer their dead bodies to be put in graves." End quote. This is a second reference to the custom of posthumous humiliation through public corpse exposure. And we also have a reference to the demographics of the city of Jerusalem at this time. As you saw earlier, John clearly describes the demographics of the residents of Jerusalem in this text as predominantly Gentile. He mentions the value of 3.5. But he is not going to tell us what to do with that value until we get to verse 11. It is a time conversion value, but it is only half of the equation, which he will finish in verse 11. In verse 10, sandwiched right in the middle of two halves of a time conversion text, John is going to give a very important description of what marks the victory of the beast over the witness, that Chronos should be no more. In verse 10 John writes, quote, "And they that dwell in the land shall rejoice over them, and make merry, and shall send gifts one to another, because these two prophets tormented them that dwelt in the land." End quote. Here John makes an historical reference to two social customs that signify victory of the beast over the witnesses. The first is that they will make merry, and the second is that they will exchange gifts. The emergence of these two social customs signify victory of the beast over the witnesses. So we will make note of that historical event and put both of those in our historical column next to verse 10. This text is sandwiched right in the middle of two halves of a time conversion text. To bring attention to it, John is dividing the number 7 by 2 to represent the two witnesses. 7 is the number for completion or fullness. Divided by 2 equals 3.5. So that is how John is getting the prophetic value of 3.5 in this text. The next verse gives us the second half of the time conversion text, which will actually give us a date for this event, because it is placed in the center between them. In verse 11, which is the second half of the time conversion, John writes, quote, "And after 3 days and a half the Spirit of life from God entered into them, and they stood upon their feet. And great fear fell upon them which saw them." End quote. Here John mentions 3.5 again for the second time, which makes 7. And he states that the Spirit of life from God enters the two witnesses, and the witnesses are revived. We have 3 columns of information in this text: historical, astronomical, and mathematical. First, John says there will be a revival of the witnesses, historically. So we will put the word revival in the historical column. Secondly, he mentions that the astronomical event marking this event will be that life will enter into the two witnesses, which you now know is a reference to Gemini. So what is John astronomically referring to as life? As you saw earlier in the beginning of the video, lunar phases or moons were used to mark the life cycle in Judaism, so astronomically speaking, John is referring to the moon entering into the constellation Gemini. We will add a notation of the moon entering into Gemini in the astronomical column to mark the astronomical dating for this historic event of the revival of the witnesses. And this event has a mathematical value of 28, which brings us to our last column of information, the mathematical column, or the time conversion of the text. Our time conversion begins with the number 7, which is 3.5 in verse 9, plus another 3.5 in verse 11, equaling a total of 7. 7 times the two witnesses is 14. And then 14 times the revival, which is 2, results in the number 28, which is the same exact number as the lunar cycle of 28 days, which is also connected to the birth of life. So you see how John has connected everything in this text, from the mathematical values to the astronomical values, back to the same symbolism and the lunar cycle of 28 days. If we take the last time conversion date given in the text of 1680 AD and add 28 to it, we get the year 1708 as the year marking the beginning of gift-giving and merrymaking, to signify the beast's victory over the witnesses of the oath that Chronos should be no more. The missing date halfway between 1680 and 1708 would be 1694, which we will now fill in. Now we come to the last section of the first prophecy in verses 12 and 13. And John is describing the same event in both verses. This is what John writes in verse 12 and 13. Quote, "And they heard a great voice from heaven saying unto them, Come up hither. And they ascended up to heaven in a cloud. And their enemies beheld them. And the same hour was there a great earthquake, and the 10th part of the city fell, and in the earthquake were slain of men 7,000, and the remnant were frightened, and gave glory to the God of heaven." End quote. This section of text is most clearly referencing a geological event, an earthquake to be exact. So we will place the word earthquake in our geological column. Now here is what amazing about John's timeline. If we are correct, we should find that the time of this earthquake is exactly and precisely 444 years from 1390 AD. Because remember, John has already given us the measuring reed for the time frame for this prophecy. And it came to 444 years. That is the year 1834 AD. Meaning if we look into geology, in Jerusalem, in the year 1834 AD, we should see this very earthquake that John has prophesied. And when we do that, precisely as expected, there was in fact a very strange earthquake in Jerusalem in the year 1834 AD. But that is not all. You remember how you saw earlier that John began the time conversions for this text with the time cycle shift, which produced the value of 126 years. The exact distance in time between John's previous time conversion date of 1708 and the last date of 1834 is exactly and precisely 126 years. Thus fulfilling the time cycle of John's prophecy, going full circle, beginning with 126 years and ending with 126 years. Precisely. Totaling 444 years exactly, in both columns of information. So 1834 AD finishes the timeline for John's first prophecy in verses 1 through 13. Now that we have the final date of John's timeline, we can go back and fill in the two previous missing dates. If we take 126 and divide it by the missing dates, it will give us the first date of 1750 AD for verse 11 and 1792 for the second. And now our historical timeline is complete. And this is what our 5 categories of information has produced parallel to one another. If we collapse all 5 columns of information down into a single strand, this is what the prophecy of this text looks like on an historical timeline, and where we should find our events taking place in history. If this were all just randomly invented or made up, there would be no way all 5 different categories of information could possibly line up perfectly together. Because there are 28 points of reference, the same number in a sidereal lunar month, 28 points of time frame material, 444 years of history, all describing the rise and fall of an era of history, of witnesses clothed in repentance. And this period of history is known as the Reformation. And when you see how accurate John's prophecy actually was, you will be blown away with shock and amazement at what John accomplished in writing his prophecy, recorded in Revelation chapter 11, verses 1 through 13, which we will show in detail in the very next video. In this video, you have seen that John's references to astronomical dating were replaced with references to Greek Nikes by Roman theologians who are defending the pagan Greco-Roman astronomical cosmology of Constantine's Byzantium Catholic Empire. And you saw that Athanasius documents earlier interpretations of Revelation, which included what he called star tables, which he was personally alienated from and a critical outsider to, not being recognized as a valid bishop by these communities. Precisely, as the documentation in the New Testament demonstrated. And you have seen that the 2 witnesses are said to stand before God in heaven. And that the temple John was discussing was also the temple in heaven. So the references in this narrative were about astronomical dating, concerning an era of history, which John measured to be 444 years. Not literalistic events on the earth concerning only 2 people. He says the prophecies in chapter 11 are about many people, languages, nations and kings on earth. And you saw that the sign of victory, by the beast over the 2 witnesses, who witnessed the oath to heaven that Chronos should be no more, was the historical emergence of a custom, of greeting one another with greetings of merrymaking, and exchange of gifts. And you saw that John's time frame, for the second woe, concluded in an earthquake in Jerusalem, in the year 1834 AD. Now that we have constructed the time frame for chapter 11 verses 1 through 13, in the next video, we will go through each verse in grammatical detail to see exactly and precisely what John was actually prophesying about this period of time, and how it was fulfilled in actual history on John's historical timeline. Thank you for watching.